Well, good evening, WNBA and LA Sparks fans, and welcome in to the LA Sparks 365 Network. Of course, your 24/7 365 comprehensive home of the WNBA and your two-time WNBA champion, Los Angeles Sparks. Good evening, folks, and welcome into the first of 12 straight nights of recaps for every WNBA team, folks, here on the WNBA season recap show. Tonight, folks, we'll be recapping and talking about the 2014 season for the Seattle Storm. Good evening, everybody. Alongside Chris Mancy via Apple's FaceTime from the 800 Studios up in Anaheim, California. Cal McClure joining you folks here from Studio 171 in San Diego. Chris, good evening. How's it been going up there, man? We had a few days off to sort of recuperate. We had a few other things going on our schedules. But other than that, how's it been going, though?
Nothing much, just hanging here. Sorry about the NBA.
Occurring. All right, folks, we're back here. We had a bit of a small little internet fizzle out here, and as you folks may know, we are still trapped mightily in still folks here in technical difficulties as we've been experiencing since the start of the postseasons. We're still working on trying to get those resolved here. But anyway, again, folks, if you did not catch the news though from our brother network here from the Sparks folks, and the Lakers 365 network launches in 2 weeks on Sunday, October 5th, 9 p.m. Pacific time, in time for the Monday preseason game. Now, folks, if you are going to be joining us on Sunday, a quick note that I may, in fact, be going to the Monday night preseason game because it is in San Diego. I'll let you folks know on Twitter about that, but we'll have that for you folks later on at a later time and date. Chris, real quick, though, before we do get to the season recap, though, we will send out your way, folks, and you guys can hit us up on Twitter at LA Sparks 365, at Calimac3, or at LA Sparks Fan 30. And you guys can hit us up there across social media for the night show. And, of course, anything else included after that. All right, Chris, we'll get to our dirty work for the night, man, which, of course, is to begin recapping the 2012 seasons of every WNBA team. Chris, going in reverse order here, easy for me to say on a Monday night, is from wins from the bottom all the way up, Chris, and of course the first team we'll talk about tonight is the Seattle Storm, Chris, who this year, sort of a transition year, man, a lot of a few speed bumps in the road for Seattle this season. They end up tied with the Tulsa Shock for the worst record in the WNBA at 12-22. Chris, the Storm normally, man, are a team that give you problems. I mean, they're well decorated, Chris, with 2 titles in 2004 and in 2010. And of course, they've been blessed to have Sue Bird for so long and Lauren Jackson. Where, Chris, I think the big turning point for their season was not having Lauren Jackson this season, Chris. Now, we know, though, that back on August 19th when we were in the Fab Forum with Crystal Thomas and Shorty Mamba 24, Chris, that Crystal told us that there was a game plan in place for Lauren Jackson where she was going to, miss the first half of the season, to train for the FIBA tournament with the Australia team, come back after the All-Star break and finish the season. Where, Chris, this year, so many injuries have been put on her plate, Chris, where now she has another nagging injury where she's going to be missing the FIBA tournament as well, Chris. So I think, Chris, the first thing that we have to drive home here, Chris, is that Lauren Jackson's absence did hurt the Storm in a big way, Chris, because that left it all on Sue Bird and a bunch of cast of characters, Chris, that really didn't have that team camaraderie or chemistry. Chris, do you really, though, thinking about it, man, do you really pin the 12-22 record on Lauren Jackson's absence, though, or what do you think right now is the big turning point for the season for the Seattle Storm?
I think probably the absence with Lauren Jackson out for the season. I think having her presence not in the lineup just got the Storm just didn't know where to go with the young lineup and everything.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, the first year I got into women's basketball, the Storm had won the 2004 WNBA title 10 years ago, man. And, they have been a team, Chris, that has always been built on having a great reputation, having a great fan base up there in Seattle, Chris. And, I mean, this year was sort of a year that I never thought I would ever see the Storm have, Chris, where it was just, a season that, was marred by injuries, Chris. But I mean, Chris, the problem, though, here was the injuries, yes. But it was to their big players. It was to Lauren Jackson and Sue Bird during the season, Chris. I mean, that's the only problem, though, with the season was there were injuries, Chris, yes, but it was to the big puzzle pieces, which basically, Chris, brought this team down to a low level. Then, Chris, the next note I brought up here, though, about the season for the Storm is the health of their vets. And, Chris, I honestly do not know how much longer Sue Bird and LJ can keep doing this, Chris, because they've been around for, 10-plus years of their careers, Chris. Now, I know they did bring 2 titles there, man, but I just think, though, that Seattle's going to have to start that unfortunate rebuilding process, Chris, which they have not had to do in many years. They've always had solid young talent. Where this year, Chris, they acquired Bria Hartley in the draft, Chris, then traded her to Washington, and then got a veteran in Crystal Langhorne, Chris. I think Brian Agler's first goal, other than having the number 1 pick in the draft next year, is you got to start rebuilding. I mean, Chris, I mean, it's going to be tough now, man, to start building a team around 2 season, 10-plus year vets in LJ and Sue Bird, Chris, because, I mean, if those 2 go down and you have a bunch of young kids, Chris, I mean, it's not really going to work out very well, man. So I look at it this way, Chris, that Lauren Jackson's absence is the first talking point, Chris. Then also it's the entire veteran leadership, Chris, that the 2 big superstars on the Storm, which was LJ and Sue, Chris, they both had injuries during the season that kept them out for a long time. So, Chris, also, we know about Jackson's absence, Chris. What about, though, the health problems or the long-term health injury effects of the injuries to Jackson and Sue Bird going forward towards next season?
I think probably don't play a lot of minutes. Just limit their playing time to maybe 20 minutes per game or something like that, and just limit their playing time.
Chris, I think that Brian Agler might go to that sort of a system where it is the minutes limit like we're going to see, Chris, with the Lakers and Byron Scott putting that on Kobe Bryant for the season. Again, folks, the Lakers 365 Network tips off on October 5th, 9 p.m. on the Lakers 365 Network in 2 weeks. Chris, the only good thing right now working in favor for the Storm right now, man, is they do have the number 1 pick in the 2015 WNBA draft secured during the draft lottery. They had them and the Tulsa Shock have the highest odds of capturing the number 1 pick because of their records. Chris, we pretty much know number 1 pick is going to be, a superstar, Chris. And the talking point here for this year, Chris, the only main puzzle piece or the main player that everyone's keeping an eye on, Chris, is Kalena Mosqueda-Lewis from Anaheim Hills, California, in your backyard over there. From UConn, Chris, who's probably going to be going number 1 overall, like we've seen across with the past few years with those great players. But again, Chris, the draft day 2015, Chris, begins the rebuilding process for the Storm. And again, it's a day that I never thought I would ever see come happen for Seattle because they were always so good with, when they had Lauren and Sue in their younger prime. Even now, they're still good, Chris. Just a matter of time of, getting, that core nucleus of players like Noelle Quinn and O'Hay and Clark and, Tanisha Wright, Chris, those other players, not Jackson and Bird, Chris, but those other players on the team to get that camaraderie and chemistry down, Chris, to get them back in the postseason next year. But, Chris, I think Seattle, though, man, that rebuilding process starts draft day. Chris, what are your thoughts going forward about as we look ahead towards the spring with the draft about the Storm beginning that rebuilding process at the draft?
I think probably we'll see a great rebuilding process starting by Seattle Storm getting a great player in the draft and probably starting their rebuilding process.
Yeah, unfortunately, Chris, that rebuilding process, takes, a few years to click in, Chris. I mean, I know we've seen it a lot in other sports with that rebuilding process, but it's going to be a while. Another interesting note here, Chris, this was the first time in about 11 years that the Storm missed the postseason, dating back to at least 2003, Chris. And again, the only reason why, Chris, I say it's a process I never thought I'd see is because the Storm, like I said earlier in the show, is they were just so good with building young talent and working around Sue Bird and Lauren Jackson when they had them in their younger days, Chris. But again, every year, Chris, though, every year there's going to be those bad years with injuries, bad play, like what we saw with the Sparks, Chris. We'll talk about them later down the week and probably into next week when we do continue our wrap-ups here. But again, Chris, it just kind of felt empty to not see the Storm in the postseason this year because they have been there for so many straight years and everything, Chris. And, Chris, when a team that you see dominate, in other sports, let's just, say, the Yankees, for instance, Chris. Chris, can you imagine how empty you'll probably feel if the Yankees don't go to the postseason in baseball this year? That's what I felt like when I didn't see the Storm in the postseason this year because they're a team that are always in the mix. They're always in the top four somewhere, and they're always getting in every season, Chris. How does it feel, though, Chris, knowing, though, that last year was the first time in about 10-plus years we didn't see the Storm in the, in the postseason picture? And also, man, how would you feel, though, as a average fan in any other sport, Chris, to not see the one franchise you like or dislike the most not in the postseason after so many great years of success?
Just feels very different not to see like most franchise in the postseason in the playoffs that we always see mostly every time, and it just feels different.
Yeah, it naturally feels different for one because it's just the way that that it's kind of gone when you've seen so many teams or you've seen teams that have been in the postseason for so many years consecutively or they've won the title consistently. That's just how it is, Chris. In case anyone's wondering out there, the Storm, league-wide, finished 11th or tied for 11th place in the WNBA as far as the record goes. They were many games off the pace of the Phoenix Mercury this year. Just going through the numbers real quick here. The Storm did finish in 5th place, basically, folks, tied for 6th place with that 12-22 record, a 3.53 win percentage. And again, Chris, as we kind of go back in detail here again about the big, at least, Chris, our big talking points here. Again, Chris, it was a seasoned team, an older veteran team. That was basically, Chris, led this year by Sue Bird in her 11th season in the league. And Seattle, I think, Chris, never got going. I think they just had a rough time all season because it was basically, Chris, almost, basically a brand new roster from last season without Tina Thompson, then without Lauren Jackson, and then with Sue Bird, playing hit and miss. This was just not a typical Seattle Storm season. And, Chris, the thing, though, I can marvel at, Chris, is regardless of how good or bad the Storm is doing, Chris, Key Arena, which I still feel, Chris, that beloved city got robbed of the Sonics up there many years ago when they left for OKC, and I still am pained to this day to see the Sonics gone, Chris. Chris, like I say a lot, and I said back on my interview with Rafael Esparza back on July 24th, Chris, is you don't have to rip people's arms off of them to go watch good basketball, Chris. And in spite of the Sonics being gone for so many years, Chris, it's good, though, man, that the Seattle basketball fan base has stayed alive and well without the Sonics being there, Chris. They have the Storm there to help them out. And, it is, by far one of the most, one of the most dedicated fan bases in the league. And, Chris, I think looking forward, though, like I say a lot about a lot of teams, Chris, but I think, though, that Seattle's future right now, Chris, is a bit blurred. But it's going to be not blurred for a long time, Chris. I think after draft day, they'll be back where they belong, Chris. Now, it'll take a few years, Chris, to develop KML if they do get her #1 overall this year. But then again, Chris, that's why you have Sue and you have Lauren, Chris, to sort of be that mentor, that sisterly figure to these young players, Chris. Chris, I know we talk a lot about the injuries with veteran players, Chris, but also, man, knowing, though, that we could see KML going to Seattle, Chris, how big of a role, though, does the veteran leadership of LJ and Sue play going forward for not just KML, Chris, if she goes there, but the rest of the players, though, with those two veteran players on their side, though?
I think it'll probably be a great momentum going forward in the future. The franchise, I think, will be in a great step, down the step in the right future.
Yeah, this is, one small step for mankind, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, Chris, basically, when you have the Storm, again, coming off, arguably, Chris, probably one of their worst years in probably all the franchise history. I don't ever recall seeing them, being this bad, and not going to the postseason for so long. And, of course, Chris, I mean, you can attribute, the record, the 10 and, the 12 and 22 record, Chris, to a few factors again, injuries as one deal, and then of course, just not really gelling, Chris. And I did say though, back on the forum, I believe back in August, that that it was a team, Chris, that looked like they were running around with their head, that looked like a coop of chickens running around with their heads cut off, because it just did. In all seriousness, though, folks, the Storm did not look the same without LJ and Sue out there, Chris. And I know that Sue had a lot of injury problems this year, either her neck, her knee, her ankle, whatever it was, Chris. But I think, though, man, going forward again, as we've been talking about here again, is once you can get LJ back to full strength and you have a fully healthy Sue Bird, Chris, then you have KML if they do get her #1 overall, Chris, you'll be set for the future for a few years, Chris. Now, again, going back to the vets, Chris, I honestly do not know how much longer those Sue and Lauren have left in the tank, Chris. I mean, they've been here 10, 12 years, and the injuries, Chris, are beginning to pile up. And, Chris, I know we talk a lot about, the overseas play, Chris. We'll get to that later on in the show here, Chris. But, Chris, to be fair here, man, how much longer, though, do you think that LJ and Sue, though, do have to mentor these young kids before they do retire and call it a career after such a great run in 2004 and 2010? How much longer, though, Chris, and I know it's kind of tough to tell time for the future, how much longer, though, do you think, though, that LJ and Sue, though, do have to continue to groom these young kids up there in Seattle?
Probably maybe, I want to say maybe like 2 years probably. That's it.
I'll say 2 to 4 perhaps for them to keep up the spirits there, and we'll see what occurs, though, with the Seattle Storm. Now, Chris, folks, by the way, again, tomorrow night here back on the network, we will have the Tulsa Shock season recap, and we will talk about them going forward. But again, folks, our season recap of the Seattle Storm is pretty simple, folks. No Lauren Jackson, the health of the veterans, and they do have the #1 pick in the draft. Missed the postseason for the first time in 11 years, and that is about it for our notes here on this. And again, folks, the Tulsa Shock recap is tomorrow night, 10 o'clock back here on the LA Sparks 265 network. Now, Chris, as we go towards FIBA now, Chris, as we segue here from the WNBA, Chris, to FIBA real quick. Team USA suffered a pretty, not really much of a thing to talk about, Chris. But again, Team USA though was defeated though yesterday to round out the France International Tournament in Paris by the final score of 76-72 last night over in Paris. Now, the upcoming schedule for the USA Women's National Team goes as follows. They do have a preseason, one more exhibition tilt tomorrow afternoon, I believe. I'm going to go back and recheck the schedule for you folks real quick. But the upcoming schedule, folks, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time, folks, Team USA will take on the Czech Republic from the Tipsport Arena in Prague. Game time again at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 o'clock Eastern. Going forward, the 2014 FIBA World Championship schedule, folks, begins next Sunday at 12:30 p.m. Pacific. And by the way, folks, all 3 USA preliminary round games can be seen on ESPN3 and the Watch ESPN app at 12:30 Pacific, 3:30 Eastern when they take on China, Serbia, and Angola for those 3 games in the FIBA tournament. Now, Chris, a few eyebrows and a few discussions broke out yesterday concerning the final roster right now for what is left here for the 2014 FIBA for the FIBA tournament right now, Chris, and it has not been a very not a very nice convo we've been having lately with a few fans about the roster, Chris, which yesterday saw Skylar Diggins, Stephanie Dolson, all cut from the roster to trim it down to 13 players. There was one more cut yesterday that the name unfortunately does elude me right now, but the notable names though were Dolson and was Stephanie Dolson along with 2 other players last night, Chris, and it really though brought basically, Chris, brought every every women's basketball fan basically off the street corner to it's kind of like what is this team doing here with the with this roster right now. And Chris, honestly, we kind of knew though that, or at least Chris, we know though that there's a bit of a small little bias toward players that have either played for UConn or have played under Gino Auriemma, But, you know, it's been a talking point for the past few days, what's going on here, or what has happened here. Again, folks, I'm trying to pull up the names here. What we do have, though, ladies and gentlemen, is Skylar Diggins, Kayla McBride was the other one, and Stephanie Dolson were all cut from the roster. Chris, you know, this is, you know, one reason why, man, that sometimes the Olympics and the FIBA tournament, Chris, is not really worth watching because of the political nonsense that goes on here between, you know, players and their colleges, Chris. I'm not really surprised, though, about Dolson being cut, Chris, because what we heard, though, was she was playing very, very poorly, and it was more so of her sightseeing more so than playing in the tournament, Chris. I was a bit shocked, though, Chris, about Kayla McBride being cut because, you know, her three-point shooting could have probably helped Team USA, and Skylar Diggins getting cut, too, was a big surprise as well, man. Your thoughts, though, man, about seeing Dolson, McBride, and Diggins all scratched off the roster for Team USA?
Just don't even know what to say about.
I mean, Chris, you know, I mean, I'm not counting us out. You know, I'm not counting Team USA up from winning the gold medal, Chris. It's just, you know, I mean, okay, you know, we know about Brittany Griner, Chris, but I mean, you know, if Griner was to get injured again, like we saw in the WNBA Finals, I mean, you need another tall center, Chris. I mean, you could have gone with Elena if she was playing, or Dolson perhaps. But again, folks, Team USA will have another exhibition game tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific against the Czech Republic in Prague tomorrow morning. And then, of course, the FIBA tournament will kick off next Sunday at 12:30 p.m. against China on ESPN3 and the Watch ESPN app. Chris, as we get set to close out of here for the night, man, of course, man, we're 2 weeks away from the launch of the LA Lakers 365 network.
Just very excited, pumped up, can't wait. Right when I was creating it last night, just getting so excited.
All right, folks, so it looks like we have had some more technical faults here, thanks to the Phoenix Mercury, because of Chris's... Apparently we're being sieged here because of Chris's flop prediction of the Sparks beating Phoenix here, so... okay, it looks like we're back here, folks, no idea, but... Chris, it looks like we're going to have to blame you here because you picked the Sparks to beat the Mercury, man, and we've been in technical difficulty problems since Game 2 ended, man. So what do you got to say for yourself, man, that we've been stuck in these technical faults? Now we're having internet problems here in studio.
I don't know. Hey, talking about that, I've been getting it ever since Game 2. My connection and my girlfriend get after me, so yeah, it's beginning to me even worse.
So perhaps what Mancy is the Sparks' jinx here, apparently. So there's a hex. Apparently, there's a hex now put on the Sparks franchise and on him and on me for some reason. But Chris, before we had a snafu here again, and this has been something that's been going on for the past couple of days, so I'm not really worried about it. Again, Chris, Lakers 365 Network tips off in 2 weeks on October 5th, 9:00 p.m. Chris, how pumped, man?
So pumped up, I'm ready to go.
So again, Lakers basketball talk on the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 365 comprehensive home of the NBA and the 16. God, I'm going to love saying that introduction. The 16-time NBA champion LA Lakers tips off on October 5th, 9 p.m. on the Lakers 365 network. Now, folks, again, if you did not, I'm sure, now, folks, I know we had two little bump-ins here, you know, with the internet problem, apparently. Just go ahead and just go on Twitter and use the handle at LASparksFan30 and tell him how much you hate him because of the Sparks, of his flop prediction for the 2014 WNBA playoffs. Just joking, buddy. But again, folks, I mean, it's been a problem we've been having, though, down here for the past couple of days. Weather hasn't been helping either, so, again, hopefully these kind of polish up quickly before we get to the Lakers network in 2 weeks. But, Chris, if we do wrap up for the night here, man, your last thoughts still about the Seattle Storm season, looking back at it going forward, And your thoughts about tomorrow as we preview the Tulsa Shock season, man, what do you got to say for yourself as we get ready to wrap up for the night?
Just the worst season by Seattle Storm, and just can't wait for tomorrow night, recapping the Tulsa Shock.
So again, folks, hopefully we won't be having conflicting problems here from the Phoenix Mercury getting their revenge on us here in the hangout, or more so on Chris, because it's been his problem, not mine. But again, folks, we don't have a perfect record here on the network. We have lost a few games here with our shows, either with the audio problems or tonight. So again, we do not have a 1,000 win percentage here, folks. We're probably, we probably have maybe 3 or 4 losses so far on the record. But folks, until tomorrow night, have a safe night. Drive home safely, never coming, and good night. Now, this has been the LA Sparks 365 Network, wrapping up the 2014 Seattle Storm season. We'll see you folks tomorrow night back here at 10 o'clock, hopefully with some better internet. We kind of hope and pray as we recap a 2014 season of the Tulsa Shock. See you folks then. Take care. Bye-bye.